According to the Federal Reserve, if you walked up to 10 American adults on the street today and just asked for $400 in cash to cover an absolute no questions asked emergency, almost four of them would have to look you in the eye and say no.
Yeah, 37% to be exact. It's a terrifying number.
It really is. I mean, we are looking at a deeply unsettling reality here where a massive swath of the population is operating with like zero financial margin.
Right. Zero margin for error.
Exactly. So today on the Generational Wealth Project, we are doing a deep dive into a highly specific, rigorously structured blueprint. And the mission today is to make sure you, the listener, are never part of that 37%.
Yeah, we're tearing down a 5-step architecture for recession readiness. Basically, a systemic defense plan to insulate your wealth from macroeconomic shocks.
Right, because I think, when we usually discuss recessions, the conversation almost always defaults to this high-level macroeconomic stuff.
Oh, for sure. People immediately start talking about inverted yield curves or, the federal funds rate.
Yeah, corporate earnings, global supply chains, all that jargon.
Exactly. But a recession fundamentally materializes at the individual level. I mean, it is a deeply personal stress test of your own household's liquidity.
Yeah, and that $400 threshold from the data, it's not about buying luxury goods.
No, not at all. It's the cost of a blown alternator,
Yeah.
right? Or the sudden urgent care copay. Or like a localized plumbing disaster in your house.
Right, the stuff that just happens in everyday life. And when over a third of the economy cannot absorb a microshock like that, it means millions of people are walking a financial tightrope over a very deep canyon.
Without a net.
Without a net. And so the mechanics of the blueprint we are analyzing today, they focus on building that net before the wind even starts blowing.
Yeah, and honestly, acknowledge where you are at right now as you listen to this. You might be actively restructuring your portfolio because you see warning signs, or, maybe you just find the mechanics of defensive wealth management fascinating.
Either way, this roadmap is engineered to strip the emotion out of economic downturns. It replaces the panic with, mathematical certainty.
Which is exactly what you need when things get turbulent.
So let's bypass the typical financial platitudes today and just get straight into the structural engineering of this plan.
Sounds good. Let's start with step 1.
Right. The entire architecture rests on a foundational diagnostic phase. The material starts by mandating comprehensive visibility over your cash flow.
Yeah, it demands a really rigorous categorization of where your money is going, basically separating essential needs from discretionary wants.
And I want to just move completely away from the word budget here, because that term carries so much behavioral baggage.
Oh, absolutely. The second people hear the word budget, they instantly associate it with moral failure or, restriction.
Right. It feels like a diet. It puts you in a scarcity mindset.
Yeah, a diet is a great comparison. But we should look at this instead as corporate cash flow forensics or like a telemetry system for your life.
The telemetry analogy is spot on. I mean, if you look at how a corporation survives the severe revenue drop, the CFO doesn't just broadly guess where to cut costs.
No, they don't guess at all. They rely on an exhaustive ledger that tracks every single cent of operating expenditure. They know their exact burn rate.
Right, and the source material is essentially telling you, the individual, to adopt the role of CFO for your own household.
Exactly. Because you cannot surgically cut inefficiencies in your spending if you don't have a high-resolution map of where your capital is actually going.
And we really need that map because human beings are incredibly prone to this behavioral trap called mental accounting.
Oh, mental accounting is the worst.
Yeah.
We categorize our spending so loosely in our heads.
Right. We always underestimate our discretionary spending by a massive margin. The cognitive dissonance is staggering.
It really is. Especially because we automate so many of our modern conveniences now.
Yes. Streaming services, cloud storage, software subscriptions.
Premium delivery memberships, all of it. They essentially become phantom expenses.
Phantom expenses, exactly. They draw down our liquidity automatically.
Right. And they completely bypass that pain of paying that we normally experience when we hand over physical cash.
So the text highlights these phantom expenses, along with dining out and travel, as the immediate levers to pull when your income drops.
Yeah, those are the first things that have to go.
But the underlying mechanic that really fascinated me here was the strict adherence to a monthly review cycle.
Ah, yes. The 30-day cadence.
Right. The blueprint doesn't advocate for an annual audit. It demands a 30-day cadence. So why is that 30-day frequency the critical variable?
Well, the 30-day frequency is mandated because the macroeconomic environment is intensely dynamic,
Yeah.
mostly because of inflation.
Right, the compounding vector of inflation.
Exactly. Inflation isn't just this static event. It is a continuous, stealthy erosion of your purchasing power.
It's always chipping away.
Constantly. The cost of your baseline existence, like your utilities, your groceries, your transportation, it shifts all the time.
So if you operate on an annual review cycle, you are basically flying blind for 11 months out of the year.
Yeah, you're totally blind. A monthly cadence allows you to dynamically adjust your capital to account for that sticky inflation.
Right, because if the consumer price index ticks up, your mandatory expenses naturally expand.
Which means they are silently cannibalizing the capital you thought was earmarked for savings or fun stuff.
Wow. Yeah, if you aren't running that telemetry check every 30 days, you won't even realize your operating margins have collapsed until you're already in the red.
It's the financial equivalent of drift. You think you're flying straight, but crosswinds are pushing you miles off course.
And in a recession, that drift is lethal because agility becomes your primary survival trait.
Absolutely. If you lose your job or your billable hours get slashed, you need to know within 24 hours exactly which outflows to terminate.
Right, just to preserve your baseline. You cannot afford the cognitive load of figuring out your fundamental burn rate while simultaneously managing the trauma of a job loss.
Yeah, that cognitive load factor is perhaps the most insidious part of financial trauma.
How so?
Well, when humans are placed under acute financial stress, our executive function drastically decreases.
Right, the brain just goes into survival mode.
Exactly. The prefrontal cortex, which handles complex planning, gets hijacked by the amygdala, which only cares about immediate survival.
So you start making terrible decisions.
Yes. So the blueprint requires you to map your cash flow right now while you are in a state of relative calm.
So the decisions are already made if a crisis hits. You're basically offloading the decision-making process to your past self.
Exactly. It's brilliant.
But that brings up a fascinating secondary challenge. Let's assume you run the telemetry. You map the cash flow, you find the inefficiencies, and you cut, say, $300 a month in phantom subscriptions.
Okay, a great start.
But that newly liberated capital is completely useless if it just sits in your checking account, right?
Oh, totally useless.
Yeah.
The laws of behavioral finance basically guarantee that money without a specific job will get absorbed by lifestyle creep.
Right. You cancel a subscription, but then you unconsciously upgrade your groceries, and the net gain is zero.
Yeah, you end up exactly where you started.
Yeah.
That freed up capital requires immediate, aggressive reallocation.
Which bridges us directly into the second step of the blueprint, engineering the structural shock absorber, the emergency fund.
Yeah, the transition from cash flow visibility to liquidity capture. This is where the theory becomes actualized defense.
So the material sets very specific parameters for this liquidity buffer. It establishes a baseline requirement of 3 to 6 months of operating expenses.
Right. But it also applies a critical risk adjustment modifier.
Yeah, let's talk about that modifier. Because if you operate with a high degree of leverage, like if you are the primary earner with dependents and a mortgage, that requirement scales up to 6 to 12 months.
And that adjustment is crucial because not all debt is created equal, and not all households have the same fixed cost rigidity.
That makes total sense. I mean, if you are a single software engineer renting an apartment, your fixed costs are relatively malleable.
Right, you could theoretically break your lease and move in with family if you lost your job.
But if you have a 30-year mortgage, property taxes, and 3 kids relying on your single salary, your household is operating like a highly leveraged corporation.
Exactly. You cannot easily liquidate a house in the middle of a recession when credit markets freeze.
No, you're stuck. Therefore, your liquidity moat has to be exponentially wider to sustain the siege.
But mathematically, accumulating 12 months of operating expenses is a monumental task. It's overwhelming.
Oh, completely. And the text acknowledges this friction. It introduces a behavioral intervention. It explicitly directs you to establish an immediate micro goal of $500 to $1,000.
Yeah, that micro goal is so important.
I want to dig into the mechanics of that because obviously it directly targets that 37% statistic we open with, but that there's a deeper layer of psychology at play here, right?
Oh, definitely. The micro goal leverages the concept of activation energy in behavioral economics.
Activation energy, right.
Yeah, when a massive, seemingly insurmountable goal is presented, like saving $40,000 for a 12-month buffer, the brain experiences goal paralysis.
It's just too big to process.
Right. The distance between where you are and where you want to be is so vast that the perceived effort outweighs the anticipated reward.
So you just do nothing.
Exactly. It leads to total inaction. But by condensing the target to just a $500 threshold, the blueprint lowers the activation energy required to begin.
It manufactures an early, highly achievable victory.
And achieving that threshold triggers a dopaminergic response, which reinforces the saving behavior and creates psychological momentum.
I love that. It fundamentally alters your self-perception. You transition from someone who, quote-unquote, can't save money to someone who has successfully engineered a functional emergency reserve.
Even if it's small at first, it changes your identity.
And the blueprint is completely uncompromising about where this capital has to reside. It mandates using high-yield savings accounts.
Yes, to counteract that inflationary decay we discussed earlier. The cash absolutely cannot sit idle
Where it's losing money. Let's talk about the mechanics of that.
Sure. It really comes down to the cost of capital and the time value of money. During periods leading up to a recession, central banks usually elevate the federal funds rate to fight inflation.
Right.
This creates an environment where risk-free yield is actually available, but only if you utilize the correct institutional plumbing.
The correct plumbing, right. Because traditional legacy banks don't give you that yield.
No, they rely on institutional inertia. They know their customers won't move their money, so they keep their deposit yields near zero.
Basically pocketing the difference.
Exactly. They capture the spread for their own balance sheets. High-yield accounts, which are usually online institutions without the overhead of physical branches, pass a portion of that central bank yield back to you.
So if inflation is running at 3%, and your capital is in a legacy account yielding like 0.1%,
Yeah.
you are guaranteeing a negative real return.
Yeah, your shock absorber is actively degrading every single day.
So capturing a 4 or 5% yield on that capital isn't even an investment strategy. It is a preservation mandate.
Exactly. It ensures the purchasing power of your defensive line remains intact.
And to make sure the money actually gets into that high-yield environment, the text deploys the ultimate weapon against behavioral fatigue: automation.
Absolute automation. It dictates that transfers must be systematically aligned with payday.
Right, the moment the primary income hits.
Yeah, this is the modern implementation of paying yourself first. By automating the extraction of savings, the exact moment income hits the ledger, you eliminate willpower from the equation.
Because willpower is a depleting resource.
Exactly. If you wait until the end of the month to see what's left over, you're allowing Parkinson's law to dictate your wealth.
Parkinson's law being the idea that work expands to fill the time allotted.
Right. And economically, discretionary spending expands to consume all available liquidity.
If the money is there, you'll spend it.
Yep. So automation intercepts the capital before your brain even has the opportunity to allocate it toward consumption.
The text actually refers to this automated liquidity buffer as a financial lifeline. And I don't think that's hyperbole at all.
Not at all. Think about the systemic risk of operating without it. If a severe macroeconomic contraction happens, credit markets tighten.
Right.
If your transmission fails and you don't have liquid cash, you are forced to bridge the gap with unsecured consumer debt.
Like credit cards. And in a high-interest environment, revolving credit card debt can carry APRs well over 20%.
Which initiates a catastrophic negative feedback loop. The cost of servicing that debt consumes your future cash flow.
Leaving you even more vulnerable to the next microshock.
Exactly. But the liquidity buffer intercepts that cycle. Yeah. It basically self-insures against volatility, so mechanical failure remains just an inconvenience, not an existential crisis.
Okay, so the foundation is set. We have total telemetry over our outflows, and we've capitalized a highly liquid, yield-bearing shock absorber.
Right.
But cash, even high-yield cash, is purely a defensive mechanism against short-term volatility.
Yes, it's just for the immediate term.
Right. To ensure generational preservation of wealth through a prolonged downturn, we have to look at the money locked away in the market.
We have to evaluate market exposure.
Exactly. So step 3 dictates a rigorous diversification of investments. The text specifically highlights broad market index funds, ETFs, and fixed income bonds to mitigate risk.
Yeah, the transition from cash to equities and fixed income represents a shift from liquidity management to risk management.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, the blueprint is deeply grounded in modern portfolio theory. The fundamental premise is that trying to guess which specific sectors will fail during a recession is statistically a losing game.
Right, stock picking is incredibly dangerous.
Highly dangerous. If you hold concentrated positions in individual equities, you are exposed to idiosyncratic risk.
Meaning the specific failure of one company.
Exactly. A recession acts as an aggressive stress test on corporate balance sheets. Companies that looked great when credit was cheap can rapidly go bankrupt when the cost of capital spikes.
Wow. So broad market index funds and ETFs eliminate that idiosyncratic risk entirely.
Yes, you are no longer betting on the survival of a single entity. You are acquiring a fractional ownership stake in the aggregate productive capacity of the entire economy.
Right. If one sector, say commercial real estate, experiences a catastrophic drop, the capital flows within the index naturally reallocate.
Exactly. But the blueprint doesn't just stop at equity diversification. It emphasizes adding bonds, especially when a recession is looming.
Right, and let's explore that because fixed income is widely misunderstood by the average investor.
It really is. Bonds essentially function as the vital counterweight in a portfolio.
How so?
Historically, high-quality government or corporate bonds have a low or even negative correlation with equities during a panic.
A flight to safety.
Exactly. When the stock market crashes and liquidity contracts, institutional capital seeks a safe harbor. So they flood into government bonds, which drives the bond prices up. So that acts as a structural shock absorber for your overall net worth. Right. Plus, the fixed interest payments provide a continuous stream of yield, regardless of what the stock market is doing.
Which allows you to rebalance.
Yes. You use that stabilized bond capital to buy equities at deeply discounted valuations during the absolute depths of the recession.
It is the ultimate expression of buying low, and it's forced by mechanical rebalancing, not emotional guessing.
Which is key, because our emotions are terrible at investing.
Which brings us to the most critical directive in this entire section, and honestly, probably the hardest to execute in reality.
The prohibition against panic selling.
Yes, the explicit warning against liquidating long-term assets during market drawdowns. We need to dissect the psychological violence of a bear market here.
It is violent.
Because understanding the math of an ETF is super easy when the market is going up, but holding it when your net worth is evaporating by 6 figures a week, that requires a completely different psychological framework.
It absolutely does. The urge to sell during a crash is driven by loss aversion. Behavioral economists like Daniel Kahneman have studied this extensively.
Right. Humans hate losing more than we like winning.
Way more. We experience the psychological pain of losing capital about twice as intensely as the pleasure of gaining that same amount.
That's insane.
And during a recession, the financial media amplifies this pain. They create an environment of continuous perceived threat.
The world is ending, sell everything.
Exactly. So your amygdala perceives the dropping net asset value not as an abstract math problem, but as a literal threat to your survival. It triggers the flight response.
Wow. So your logical brain knows you don't need the money for 20 years, but your primitive brain is screaming for safety.
Right. Which leads to liquidating assets at the exact point of maximum financial opportunity.
And the mathematical devastation of that behavioral failure is absolute.
Oh, it destroys portfolios.
Because when you panic sell, you are basically executing 2 catastrophic errors at the exact same time. First, you crystallize a paper loss into permanent capital destruction.
Yes, you didn't actually lose your fractional ownership of those companies. You just voluntarily sold your shares to someone else at a massive discount.
Right. And second, which is even more dangerous, you virtually guarantee that you will miss the subsequent recovery.
And the data on this is unequivocal.
It is. If you look at any multi-decade market cycle, the days with the highest percentage gains almost invariably clustered within mere weeks of the days with the most severe drops.
It's called the volatility clustering phenomenon.
Yeah.
The market price is in the worst-case scenario really fast. But the moment the data shows a tiny inflection point toward recovery, exactly, the institutional capital floods back in, resulting in explosive upward gaps.
And if you've moved all your money to cash, you miss those critical days.
And missing just the 10 best trading days in a 20-year period can literally cut your compounded growth rate in half.
Half. That's unbelievable.
It's just math. The blueprint treats market drawdowns not as anomalies, but as structural features of capitalism. Volatility is just the toll you pay for outperforming inflation over the long run.
Which perfectly underscores why the liquidity buffer from step 2 is so vital.
Yes, everything is connected.
You can only maintain the psychological fortitude to hold equities through a 50% drop if your immediate survival is secured by your emergency fund.
Right. If your emergency fund is full, you honestly don't care what the stock market does this month because you don't need to sell shares to buy groceries.
The structural layers protect your psychology.
Exactly.
But all of these defensive layers, the optimized cash flow, the high-yield buffer, the diversified portfolio, they all rely on one massive assumption.
The continuous inflow of fresh capital.
Right. They assume your human capital, your ability to trade your time and expertise for a salary, remains intact. So what happens when that primary node of wealth generation is severed?
And this is where we pivot from passive defense to active offense. Step 4 of the blueprint focuses on eliminating the single point of failure in your income.
Right. In systems engineering, a single point of failure is a part of a system that, if it fails, brings down the whole ship.
Yes. And for the vast majority of the population, their W-2 job is a massive, highly vulnerable single point of failure.
If management decides to execute a 10% workforce reduction, your sole source of capital goes to zero instantly.
Which is terrifying.
Yeah.
So the blueprint outlines a strategy of aggressive income diversification. It splits this into two distinct modalities, active income and passive income.
Let's look at the active side first. It suggests monetizing existing skills, freelancing, consulting, or doing fractional gig work like rideshare or food delivery.
Right.
Now, my immediate pushback when reading this was the reality of labor fatigue. I mean, we are discussing individuals who might already be stretched to their absolute cognitive and physical limits by their main job. Is the strategy here really just to work 80-hour winds until you burn out, or is there a deeper point about risk mitigation?
It is entirely about risk mitigation. It's about creating asymmetrical options.
Okay, expand on that.
The goal isn't necessarily to replace your primary income with a side gig, but to establish a secondary conduit of capital that is already operational before a crisis hits.
Ah, I see.
Building a freelance client base or navigating the onboarding for the gig economy, it takes time and energy. If you wait until you are fired to start that process, you are trying to build the engine while the plane is falling out of the sky.
Right. The friction of starting from zero while under extreme financial stress usually just leads to paralysis.
Exactly. It's the difference between kinetic and potential energy.
Right. If you have an established secondary income stream, even if it's only bringing in $500 a month during normal times, the infrastructure is already built.
You have the clients, the tax implications are sorted, the payment gateways are set up.
So if you lose the main job, you just turn the dial up on the secondary channel. You scale your labor from 500 to 3,000.
Yes. It prevents the total collapse of capital inflow. The text describes this harrowing sequence of events for people who lack this redundancy. It's a cascading failure.
A cascading failure. Walk us through that cascade.
Well, it's a textbook liquidity trap. A household loses its primary income. Because there's no secondary infrastructure, the cash inflow instantly flatlines.
Right.
They immediately start drawing down the emergency buffer. But because finding equivalent employment in a recession can take 6 to 9 months, the buffer gets exhausted.
So then what? Credit cards.
Yep. To survive, they pivot to high-interest unsecured debt. By the time they finally get a new job, they've accumulated a debt burden that will consume their surplus capital for the next 5 years.
Wow. But an active secondary income stream slows the burn rate of the emergency buffer.
Exactly. It extends your runway. And in a severe recession, having a 12-month runway instead of a 4-month runway is the difference between negotiating a fair salary at a new job versus accepting a predatory offer out of sheer desperation.
Time is the ultimate luxury in the recession, and diversified income buys you time.
Absolutely.
But the text also highlights a much more elegant solution for long-term sustainability, which is passive income.
Yeah, specifically through dividend-yielding equities with a proven history of growth.
This requires a deep dive because the distinction between active and passive income fundamentally alters the trajectory of generational wealth.
It really does. Active income is constrained by the laws of physics. There are only 24 hours in a day, and your biological energy is finite.
Right, you can only drive an Uber for so many hours. So how does the architecture of a dividend aristocrat bypass this limitation?
Well, when you buy shares in a historically robust dividend-paying corporation, you are executing a fundamentally different strategy than just hoping the stock price goes up. You are purchasing a fractional claim on the free cash flow generated by that enterprise.
Right.
And the defining characteristic of these companies, the dividend aristocrats, is their entrenched market positioning and disciplined capital allocation. They usually provide essential goods with inelastic demand.
Inelastic demand, meaning People don't stop buying toothpaste or basic pharmaceuticals just because the economy is in a downturn.
Exactly. People still pay their utilities,
No.
so their free cash flow remains relatively stable even when broader macroeconomic indicators are plummeting.
And then the company takes a portion of that sustained profit and distributes it directly back to the shareholders as a cash dividend.
Yes, you are receiving capital inflow without expending any biological energy or time.
Yeah.
You don't clock in, you don't manage clients, you just hold the asset.
That's the dream. But what makes the blueprint's focus on a history of growth so critical here? Why not just buy any high-yield dividend stock?
Because the growth component is the ultimate hedge against inflation. A company that increases its dividend payout annually is signaling extreme confidence in its operational efficiency.
So the payout goes up every year.
Right. If you buy a stock yielding 3% today, and they increase that payout by 6% every year, your yield on your original cost basis continues to compound.
Wow. So in a recession, while your primary salary might be frozen or even eliminated, this passive dividend stream just keeps flowing.
It acts as a subterranean aqueduct of capital. It slowly builds a floor underneath your finances that is entirely disconnected from your labor.
I want to challenge everyone listening to audit their current income architecture right now. Are you operating with a single point of failure?
Most people are.
Right. What human capital do you possess, like coding, project management, technical repair, that could be translated into a decentralized income stream tomorrow?
You have to build the infrastructure now.
And more importantly, are you systematically converting a portion of your active labor capital into passive dividend-generating assets? Because the ultimate goal here is reaching the crossover point where your passive capital inflows exceed your baseline outflows.
Yes. Once you hit that vector, a recession ceases to be a threat and simply becomes a cycle.
But to get there, we have to look at the final foundational layer of this blueprint. Because you can build the perfect cash flow system, accumulate the buffer, diversify the portfolio, and structure the income streams.
But it can all fall apart.
Exactly. If the physical and digital reservoir where you store this wealth is compromised, the entire architecture collapses.
Right, the counterparty risk.
Yes. Step 5 addresses institutional counterparty risk. It demands that you aggressively vet your financial institution.
This is the examination of the systemic plumbing.
Hmm.
We entrust the entirety of our liquid net worth to institutions that operate on fractional reserve banking.
Right, we just assume absolute permanence. We treat our legacy banks like they are sovereign entities.
But they aren't. They are highly leveraged, profit-seeking corporations.
And the blueprint lists really stringent criteria for evaluating them. Zero friction fee structures, high yield access, robust tech interfaces, and absolute regulatory insurance.
The complacency surrounding institutional loyalty is staggering to me.
Oh, people never change their banks.
Never. The average consumer operates with intense institutional inertia. They open an account at a regional bank when they get their first job, set up direct deposit, and then completely ignore the mechanics of the relationship for decades.
They just absorb $12 monthly maintenance fees, overdraft penalties, and sub-inflationary interest rates as if they are inescapable laws of nature.
Yeah. And why is that passive acceptance so dangerous, particularly in a recession?
It's dangerous because capital efficiency is paramount. If you are being charged a fee just to keep your own money in an account yielding 0%, you are experiencing a slow, continuous bleed of your defensive resources.
Over a decade, factoring in the lost opportunity cost of compounding interest, that inertia costs thousands of dollars.
Thousands. So the blueprint's recommendation to migrate to online institutions is based on structural economic realities.
Online banks lack the massive real estate and personnel overhead of legacy banks. They utilize that saved capital to offer significantly higher APYs, annual percentage yields, and to eliminate those predatory fee structures.
Which connects directly back to the liquidity buffer we built in Step 2. If you do the hard behavioral work of saving $10,000 and you leave it in an account paying 0.01%, inflation is actively destroying it.
Moving that capital to a high-yield account is not an investment risk. It's a structural necessity.
Right. Furthermore, the blueprint emphasizes the necessity of technological superiority, real-time transaction alerts, and frictionless app integrations.
Because that's not just about convenience. It's about defensive velocity.
Defensive velocity, I like that.
If your debit card is compromised during a period of instability, you cannot afford to wait 3 days for a pending transaction to post before you realize your liquidity has been drained.
Right. Real-time telemetry alerts let you freeze the account instantly.
And the ability of these modern platforms to seamlessly integrate with your budgeting software ensures that the first step of this entire blueprint budgetary visibility remains frictionless. If the plumbing creates friction, the behavior stops.
But all the yield and the tech bells and whistles mean absolutely nothing if the institution itself goes under.
Right. Insolvency.
The text issues a non-negotiable mandate regarding security. You must verify, without a shadow of a doubt, that your capital is insured by the FDIC or the NCUA for credit unions.
Yeah, people see these acronyms plastered on bank doors, but they rarely understand the actual mechanics of what they prevent.
Let's dissect the anatomy of a bank run and why this regulatory backstop is the bedrock of the entire system.
So to understand the FDIC, you really have to understand the inherent fragility of banking.
Fractional reserve banking.
Exactly. When you deposit $100 into a bank, the bank does not put that money in a vault with your name on it.
No, they lend it out.
Right. They keep a tiny fraction in reserve to handle daily withdrawals. And they lend the vast majority of it out for mortgages, corporate loans, long-term bonds.
The bank relies on a duration mismatch, borrowing short-term from depositors to lend long-term to borrowers.
And that system works perfectly until a macroeconomic shock occurs and a large percentage of depositors panic and demand their money back at the exact same time.
Because the bank's capital is locked up in 30-year mortgages, they literally do not have the liquid cash to satisfy the withdrawal demands.
They become functionally illiquid,
Ah.
which triggers a panic cascade. We saw glimpses of this exact mechanism recently with major regional bank failures.
The rumor of insolvency becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly. Prior to the FDIC in the 1930s, a bank failure meant the total permanent annihilation of your deposit capital. You were just an unsecured creditor.
Wow. So the psychological trauma of that dynamic meant that at the first sign of economic trouble, the mathematically rational choice was to sprint to the bank and withdraw your cash before your neighbor did.
It was a classic Nash equilibrium, where individual rational behavior led to a catastrophic systemic outcome. The FDIC alters the game theory entirely.
Right. It provides a sovereign guarantee, backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government, that your deposits up to $250,000 per depositor are secure regardless of the institution's operational failure.
It is a psychological manipulation tool as much as it is a financial insurance policy.
Yeah.
By guaranteeing the safety of the capital, the FDIC removes the incentive to panic.
It stops the bank run before it even starts.
Exactly. If your high-yield online bank makes terrible risk management errors and is seized by regulators on a Friday, the FDIC ensures your liquidity buffer remains accessible, often by Monday morning.
Your personal financial architecture remains completely insulated from the counterparty risk of the executives at the bank.
This is why the blueprint places such absolute emphasis on verification. In recent years, we've seen decentralized finance platforms, algorithmic stablecoins, and unregulated fintech apps offering crazy yields.
Yields that far outpace traditional banking.
But they operate outside the regulatory perimeter of the FDIC. So when the tide recedes during a recession, these platforms collapse, and depositors discover their high-yield accounts were actually high-risk, unsecured loans.
And in a recession, the return of your capital is infinitely more important than the return on your capital.
100%.
So I want everyone listening to execute an immediate operational audit based on this final pillar. Do not assume your capital is structurally secure just because the app interface looks polished.
Right. Log in your banking portal today, verify the APY so you aren't bleeding purchasing power.
Audit the fee structure to eliminate institutional friction, and physically locate the FDIC or NCUA verification. If your institution fails on any of these metrics, you need to initiate a capital migration immediately.
Because the overarching theme of this entire five-step architecture is the transition from a reactive posture to a proactive defense.
A recession is an external macroeconomic event over which you have zero control.
Right. You cannot control the federal funds rate or global supply chains.
But you have absolute control over your internal capital allocation. Let's quickly synthesize the architecture we've reverse engineered today as a cohesive defense matrix.
Okay, step one. You establish absolute telemetry. You map every outflow, bypass mental accounting, and run a 30-day review cycle to dynamically adjust to inflation. You locate the inefficiencies and extract the surplus capital.
Step two, you immediately deploy that extracted capital into a structural liquidity buffer. Overcome activation energy with a $500 micro goal, and automate the flow into a high-yield reservoir, building up to a risk-adjusted 3 to 12 months of operating expenses.
Step 3. You establish long-term exposure to the broader economy through diversified index funds and bonds. You acknowledge that volatility is the cost of admission, and you completely override the urge to panic sell, relying on your emergency fund for psychological safety.
Step 4, you decentralize your human capital. You architect multiple streams of income, establishing the kinetic infrastructure for freelance work before a crisis hits, while systematically acquiring dividend-yielding assets to build a passive cash flow.
And finally, step 5. You secure the entire matrix by eliminating institutional counterparty risk. You demand high-yield efficiency, zero-friction tools, and the non-negotiable backstop of FDIC or NCUA insurance.
You build a fortress that cannot be breached by the failures of leveraged banking executives.
When you stack these layers of defense, the psychological paradigm shifts entirely. You stop viewing an economic downturn as an existential threat.
Instead, you view it through the lens of capital efficiency. Because when you hold secure liquidity while the rest of the market is constrained by panic, a recession transitions from a period of extreme vulnerability to a period of unprecedented generational opportunity.
You actually have the capital to acquire high-quality assets at deep discounts because you built the architecture to survive the winter.
That is the ultimate inflection point. And I want to leave you with a scenario to evaluate your current positioning. Imagine the leading indicators are correct, and a severe macroeconomic contraction materializes tomorrow. Unemployment spikes, credit markets freeze, and the media is just a relentless barrage of panic.
The worst-case scenario.
Right. If your primary node of income is severed, how does your reality unfold? If you've ignored this architecture, you join the 37%. You are instantly consumed by the terror of insolvency, forced to take on predatory debt just to keep the lights on.
It's a nightmare.
But imagine the alternative. Imagine receiving that termination notice, but knowing your fixed costs are ruthlessly optimized. Knowing you possess a fully capitalized, high-yield liquidity buffer that guarantees your survival for the next 9 months.
Knowing your long-term wealth is diversified, your secondary income channels are ready to scale, and your money is locked inside an insured fortress.
How does your physiology change in that moment? How does your interaction with your family change when the panic is replaced by mathematical certainty?
It changes everything.
That absolute, unshakable peace of mind is not a luxury reserved for the ultra-wealthy. Ask yourself, how much is that absolute peace of mind actually worth to you? It is the direct result of executing the systemic engineering we discussed today. Analyze your architecture, close the vulnerabilities, and build your net.
Start today.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into financial readiness. This concludes today's session of the Generational Wealth Project. Stay analytical, stay disciplined, and we will see you on the next deep dive.